Hmm. Hey, good morning. Happy New Year to everyone. We're just going to wait a few moments to before we start. We're very excited to kick off our 2026 year. Uh, year 2026, our fifth year, uh, which will. But it's good to see so many of you here this morning. And as you know, speaker this morning was Richard Boles, who we will introduce in a few moments. Mhm. But, well, again, Happy New Year to everyone. And it's good to see each and every one of you and to welcome you into this new year, into our fifth year. This is the Slave Legacy History Coalition's fifth year. And we have the distinct honor this morning of having Professor Richard Boles from Oklahoma State University, correct. And he will be speaking with us in a moment. Uh, but prior to that, I'd like to, first of all, thank not only Marike and Naomi for helping us move along and continue over these last 5 years. Marike Van Dam is with History Cambridge, who facilitates the audio and visual component of our, our program, our meeting. And of course, Naomi, many of you who have met who does so much. It's kind of hard to cover. But I like to turn it over to Naomi, and Naomi will bring us up to date on the announcements that she has.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Give me one moment. I'm going to get the newsletter up on my screen. But I'll also put it in the chat so you can follow along um, as I read through the announcements. And as always, I invite everyone to utilize the chat as I go through announcements to say hello, put in any announcements of your own as well. But to start off, Monday will be Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So this week in Boston will be the inaugural MLK Boston Beloved Community Weekend, which will feature several events, including the Boston Children's Chorus, MLK concert, and then the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Breakfast. So there are several ways to get involved this weekend. Then the evening of January 25th, Eudaimonia will be presenting their concert, Thin Places and Narrow Passages. Eudaimonia is a musical group that uses performance to lift up the humanitarian work of local social action organizations. And this performance, they will be partnering with Lesley University's Dance and Movement Therapy program, which teaches the power of dance as a channel for trauma recovery and community repair. And now through February 28th, you'll have an opportunity to see the outdoor art installation, The Forgotten Souls of Tory Row, which first debuted in 2022 and is now back in 2026. It was co-created by artists Gail Boss and Pam Goncalves, who I believe is on the call with us this morning. And Egypt Lloyd, who is not here with us today, has also consulted on the project. Um, and Expanding on their 2022 collaboration, the artists continue the essential work of honoring the enslaved African and Indigenous people whose labor shaped Tory Row, individuals long omitted from Cambridge's written history. And if you'd like to learn more about this history, you can join History Cambridge for a talk on January 26th on the Black experience in West Cambridge, which features Pam Goncalves as one of the speakers, as well as Paula Paris, who's actually on our board. And jumping ahead in the calendar, make sure you save the date for March 28th. for a performance of the Harlem Renaissance Revisited with a gospel flavor, a play written by Haywood Fennell Sr., revised by Monica Anderson Spencer. This performance will be at the Cambridge Ringen Latin School. And like I mentioned earlier, Monday will be Martin Luther King Day. And on that day, the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta will be live streaming their commemorative service. And Monday morning, we'll send out an email with the live stream link as well as other events going on that day. And finally, some of you may have received our progress report. As Dennis said, we are celebrating our 5th year, and this was an opportunity for us to look back at the past 4 years. So if you click on this link in the newsletter, it'll take you right to that progress report. I encourage everyone to take a look. So that's it from me. I will pass it back to Dennis if you want to add anything and introduce our speaker today.
Okay. No, thank you. Thank you very much, Naomi. As always, thank you for your, continued assistance and work with us. Um, Naomi mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, today our speaker is Professor Richard Boles, Associate Professor of History and Interim Director of Religious Studies at Oklahoma State University. Um, he's the author of several books, of which you can see them listed in our announcement. And Dr. Boles is currently working on a new book about the way that African Americans and Indigenous Americans shared and exchanged religious ideas and practices during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The current book, which I believe Professor Boles will speak on, is Dividing the Faith, which is a very, I have recently purchased the book myself, and it is very, very compelling and interesting, gives you an in-depth background on how faith has been divided in America. However, without any further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Boles, Richard Boles, and I would like to welcome him to our Speakers Forum. And I must note that Professor Richard Boles is our 44th speaker on the Slave Legacy History Coalition platform. Professor Boles?
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a great honor for me to join with you this morning and to share a little bit of what I've learned over many years of research and writing about an aspect of slavery in New England. So I'll bring up some slides to share. I'm very grateful for the work that the Slave Legacy History Coalition has been doing the last 5 years. And again, thank you so much for inviting me to share with you today. I'd like to begin by talking about someone that is fairly familiar. The image here is of Phillis Wheatley from her book of poetry. As many of you probably know, Phillis Wheatley was stolen from her family in Senegambia. About 1761, European slave traders transported her to Boston to be sold. She was about 7 years old. The Wheatley family that purchased her treated her far better than most enslaved people in the 18th century, and she received a thorough education. But her writings indicate that she still longed for freedom. In a 1774 letter, Wheatley stated that in every person, quote, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. Wheatley began writing poetry in 1765. It was often religious in content. Church records from the Old South Church of Boston and Brattle Street indicate that Phillis Wheatley was baptized by the Reverend Samuel Cooper on August 18th, 1771, at the Old South Meeting House in Boston. That's the building that's still there on Washington Street. Her baptism occurred less than 3 years before that meeting house became the center of protest for the Boston Tea Party. She continued to worship at Old South for many years, and in 1773 she traveled to England, and where some of her poetry was published in London as a book titled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. The fact that we have this engraving of her likeness is evidence that her experience of enslavement was exceptional. Wheatley was in the late 18th century, and I think remains today, probably the most famous Black Christian from the colonial era. Despite the uniqueness of her experiences and accomplishments, however, Phyllis Wheatley was metaphorically just the tip of the iceberg in terms of African American participation and affiliation with predominantly white churches in New England. Thousands of African Americans and hundreds of Native Americans publicly participated in or affiliated with predominantly white churches in New England and other parts of the North during the 18th century and into the early 19th century. This was so frequent that most New Englanders of this era worshipped, experienced corporate religious life in interracial contexts during the 18th century and into the first decade of the 19th century, before churches gradually separated along racial lines. New England churches, especially congregational Anglican ones, were commonly interracial. Almost wherever there were people of color in New England, they participated in the central institutions of these communities. And this fact alters how we think about New England's history and the history of race and slavery in the region. These churches were, as I noted, interracial, but they were not integrated. And that distinction is important. These churches implicitly and sometimes explicitly justified slavery and the dispossession of indigenous people from their lands. But African Americans and Native Americans' participation in these churches was not passive. They actively sought to remake colonial Christianity and to have the churches serve their own interests. So in making these larger points, I'm going to focus on a couple of interrelated questions. And I'll try to go through these questions through this short presentation. In what ways did African Americans and Native Americans participate in predominantly white New England churches? What motivated or caused their involvement in these churches? What can we know? We can't know everything, obviously, but what can we know about the participation and what it might have meant to some of them? And how did African Americans and Native Americans shape these churches and religious life across the region? So to the first point, or the first question, in what ways and to what extent did African Americans and Native Americans participate in the 18th century New England churches? Interracial worship was more common in New England churches than has been generally assumed by past generations of historians. And I'd like to begin with an instructive example from New London, Connecticut. On a cool evening, a Wednesday, October 29th, 1738, church members and other congregants converged on the New London Meeting House to attend the midweek lecture service and witness several baptisms. As many of the town's inhabitants arrived, they took their assigned seats in the high-walled box pews and benches. Church seating was a contentious issue in New London, as it was in many New England towns. The pews were assigned based on people's ability to pay rental fees, as well as other factors including wealth, status, age, public service, family connections, gender, and race. There was such a high demand for seating that a second gallery was added above the first one. So kind of a three-story church interior. As with most services, the congregants sang psalms without instruments and listened to a well-prepared sermon by Reverend Adams. This is a photo of a sermon that was preached and later published from 1735. And the sermon publication begins with, "To my dear friends, the flock under my pastoral care." Well, the flock under his pastoral care included both Black and Indigenous people. each of the previous Wednesday gatherings in October, a child had been baptized. But on this night, October 29th, an adult named Phyllis and 4 children, Ishmael, James, Ziba, and Solanus, were to be baptized. At the appointed time, we can imagine Phyllis and the children proceeded towards the front of the church. They likely descended down narrow stairs from the upper gallery. They walked towards the Reverend Adams, who was both the pastor of the First Church of Christ in New London and the person who held legal title to these 5 enslaved people of African descent. By law and by custom, these slaves owed Adams their obedience and lifelong labor. Phyllis stood in front of the congregation. She saw wealthier congregants nearest to her, but if she raised her eyes towards the galleries, she may have seen some of the other Black or Mohican or Pequot people in attendance at the church. Phyllis made a profession of her faith and owned the church covenant, which is to say she affirmed her understanding of and belief in the doctrines of Christianity and submitted herself to the oversight and discipline of the church members. She was always liable to be punished by her master, her owner, the Reverend Adams, but now church members could also censor Phyllis or remove Phyllis from church fellowship for moral failings. After owning the covenant, Adams baptized Phyllis. Next, Phyllis's children, James, Ziba, and Solanus, were baptized, as well as Ishmael, another enslaved child. Adams promised to educate these 4 children in Christianity as part of his responsibility as a metaphorical patriarch, a role typically assumed by English masters of bonded and enslaved laborers. For Adams, the sacrament of baptism was a sacred duty performed regularly for children of believing parents or adults who owned the covenant, made a profession of faith. Infants, children, adults could all be baptized and participate in this sacrament, either on the testimony of a guardian's faith or by their own profession. Adams baptized 57 people in 1738. For Phyllis, the meaning and significance of her baptism are unclear. The historical record provides no hint at how she felt or what she thought about this ritual. Perhaps Adams used promises or threats to pressure her into this religious act. Perhaps she made the choice to do so herself. We simply don't know. Although a minority in the New London Church, Phyllis and her children were hardly the only non-white worshippers. During the 1730s and 1740s, at least 16 Indigenous people and 15 people of African descent were baptized at this church. Along with, among some of the Indigenous people were the Mohican sachems Benjamin Uncas II and several of his family members. And here you see the Uncas Monument, Norwich, Connecticut. These baptisms were a small but noticeable minority among hundreds of baptisms performed during this era at the church. People of color from across New England participated in predominantly white churches like the one in New London, as individuals and small groups. Collectively, they were making these churches more representative of the diversity of British colonial societies. As these examples suggest, African Americans and Native Americans participated in 18th century churches in different ways. They attended services, singing, praying, listening to sermons. They received a religious education, sometimes learning how to read, even if they were enslaved. Some were baptized, some had their children baptized. Smaller numbers became full members and communicants. Some enslaved people were married by ministers and their marriages recorded in church records. Others were buried in church burial grounds. So between 1730 and 1790, before there were independent Black churches in the North, Black men, women, and children were regularly connected to the predominantly white Congregational and Anglican churches. Moreover, as Linford Fisher has shown us in his first book, Pequot, Narragansett, Mohican, Wampanoag, and other Indigenous people began participating in predominantly white churches in substantial numbers during the 1730s and 1740s, before they left and formed their own congregations or ceased to practice Christianity. In congregational churches across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and southern Maine, African Americans and Native Americans not only attended, but were also baptized and accepted as members. This map shows the locations of about 120 congregational and Anglican churches where I've identified multiple baptisms of African Americans and Native Americans across the region, more concentrated in some of the coastal towns, right? Newport, Boston, Salem, but scattered across smaller communities and rural communities as well. But this is kind of largest concentration, about 120 or so churches from 1730 to 1749. But moving forward, there still continued throughout the rest of the 18th century to be numerous such examples. In the shorter time period of 1750 to 1763, I identified about 100 churches with multiple African American or Native American baptisms. 75 of these churches in the period of 1764 to 1790, which is still significant because the disruptions of the Revolutionary War kind of interrupted the processes of many of these churches. So let me get a little bit at how I kind of know this or how I developed these findings. And one thing that is important to know is that church records from across New England in the 18th century often include racial notations in the church records. In fact, they almost always include racial notations in the church records. So here's one example. These are a portion of the baptisms that were listed in the Old South Boston church records from 1741. And in this case, there are people who are identified with racial notations who presumably are of African and Indigenous ancestry. So the church records usually included racial notations like these on lists of baptisms, list of members, marriages, and death records. And when you look at hundreds of congregations like I did, you can see trends in participation as they changed over time. Here's another example of a record. This one is from Abington, Massachusetts. The very bottom of the page indicates that on December 26, it says, "My black man, Tony, made a confession of his former evil and sinful life and declared how God had met him and was baptized." Here is the minister of the church, who was himself a slave owner, noting in the records that Tony, who he enslaved, had made this public confession, this public declaration, and was baptized in the church. In some of these congregations, there's only 1 or 2 or 3 African-American baptisms over the course of the decade. Right? Some rural communities didn't have very many African-Americans in rural New England. And so I would make the case that even small numbers in some communities are still significant, are still telling. The participation was often meaningful for the people who were involved, even if the total numbers in some communities are very small. Some of these towns, again, had only a few Black residents. The Second Church of Christ in Amesbury, Massachusetts is one example. There was 1 Black child and 1 Indigenous child baptized there in the 1740s. 4 more Black children were baptized there in the 1750s. But Amesbury had an estimated population of only 5 African-American people over age 16 in 1755, and the town had multiple churches. So it seems that a large percentage of the African-American people in colonial Amesbury were participating in some way in one of the churches. And we see larger numbers of participation when we look at some of the larger cities of New England. And so I looked at the 12 oldest Boston churches and counted total numbers of baptisms, but also baptisms where there's a racial notation. And so for the period of 1730 to 1749, across these 12 churches, I found 254 people identified as being of African descent. Out of a total almost 10,000 baptisms, that is roughly 2.7% of the baptisms across Boston's churches in those years were people of African descent. In the period of 1750 to 1763, shorter time period. So there's only about 5,000 total baptisms in all those churches, and then 143 of them were identified as people of African descent. And so that's actually a slightly higher percentage, just barely, 2.79% of the baptisms. Boston numbers included both congregational churches and Anglican churches. Across New England, and really across the whole entire North, Church of England parishes, Anglican churches, which usually go on to become Episcopalian churches after the Revolution. Many of these churches baptized African Americans at higher rates than some of the congregational churches across the region. So this map shows you the Church of England parishes, the Anglican churches, from 1764 to 1776, where I found multiple African American baptisms, and goes from kind of Queen's Chapel in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, down to coastal Massachusetts, Boston's three oldest Anglican churches, King's Chapel, Christ Church, now known as Old North, Trinity Church, and proceeds down through Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and down to Philadelphia. Looking at one of those churches on the example, we can look at Trinity Church in Newport. This congregation in Newport during the 1760s and 1770s baptized more African Americans than all of Newport's other churches combined. 51 people are identified as Black in the baptismal records of this church between 1764 and 1776. At least 21 of the people baptized were adults. So it's not simply infants being baptized, obviously without knowledge or without consent. A significant proportion of the baptisms in this case were adults who were at least in having some level of agency, some level of choice within the institution of slavery in participating with this religious ritual. Several of Connecticut's churches, particularly near Mohican and Pequot land reserves, had high numbers of Indian participants, in addition to some African Americans. Groton, Stonington, New London, Lebanon, Old Lyme, Hebron, Norwich, Connecticut were places where Indigenous people were most active during the 1730s and 1740s, before mostly stopping their participation in predominantly white churches. And that legacy plays out in a variety of ways. This is Samson Occam, Mohican. He becomes the first ordained Native American Presbyterian minister, but he is also engaged with many congregational churches. He was ordained in 1759, and he ends up being a leader and preaching at many of the autonomous Native American churches across the region, as well as continuing to have some relationships with some of the white churches. The small numbers of Native Americans affiliated with predominantly white New England churches after the 1760s are mostly Indigenous people who are living as servants or slaves or bonded laborers in white households, far away from some of the Native American communities that maintained their own churches. As I've already mentioned, these churches were interracial, not integrated. Black and Indigenous people did not participate in these churches on equal terms. Throughout the colonial era, Protestant ministers routinely owned enslaved people, participated in their commodification, and asserted their possession of them across all types of documents, but including in church records. The church records often have phrases like "my servant" or "my slave." And so the records themselves are part of the commodification and a dehumanizing aspect of slavery in that way. These are little excerpts of some of the records from the parish records of the Congregational Church of York, Maine. This parish raised 120 pounds sterling to purchase a slave for the parish and for their minister, Reverend Samuel Moody. A few years after the parish had purchased this man, the Reverend Moody was not happy. The parish came to vote about it again, and they voted to, quote, sell the man named Andrew, belonging to the said parish, at the best advantage. Not only did ministers and churches use the labor of enslaved people, but they also sometimes sought a financial advantage in selling them. Beyond this, the churches and the white Christians placed severe limits on the participation that Black and Indigenous people could be involved in the churches. They could not usually vote in church affairs. Women of all races are also usually excluded from voting. Along with seating arranged by status and sometimes by gender, predominantly white churches required Black and Native American people to occupy segregated seatings in the balconies or the back of the main floor during worship. The Old South Church in Boston voted in 1730 to have a person provide, quote, oversight of the children and servants in the galleries. On one occasion, for an ordination service in 1733, the Congregational Church of Bradford, Connecticut, ordered that no people of African descent be admitted to the meeting house at all. So we've got this kind of tension, right? We see large numbers of African American baptisms across the decades and across the region. We also see that the churches are maintaining slavery and are helping create race and racism across the region. So it kind of leads to the question of how do we understand this participation? How should we understand African Americans and Indigenous people and their choice when they had a choice, not always a choice. So how should we understand their participation and what it meant, despite the limitations and marginalization that they experienced? And so I would argue that what motivated or caused their involvement is pretty fluid and differs from person to person. Kind of in short, there's a wide variety of reasons why an enslaved Black person or a Native American person would choose to participate or attend some of these churches. There are reasons that are both material and spiritual. Church services were opportunities to see other enslaved friends and family members scattered across a town. Black and Indigenous people often sought education through the churches. Church membership conferred a degree of social status in these societies. Christianity could provide a positive identity. Some people are seeking out sympathetic ministers to deal with legal disputes, etc. Without a doubt, education is one of the reasons why Black and Indigenous people are affiliating with these churches during the colonial era. At the Second Congregational Church of Newport, Rhode Island, under the ministry of Ezra Stiles, numerous African American children are attending a catechism class where they're learning probably how to read along with church doctrines. Stiles kept records of who's attending his catechism classes, and there were almost always Black children along with white children learning from Stiles in these catechism classes. Back to Trinity Newport, this church, along with many other Anglican churches across the North, organized schools specifically for enslaved and free African American children. In 1771, their school enrolled 30 Black children who were taught, quote, reading, writing, sewing, etc. In the spring of 1774, 38 students were involved in their school. The names of many of these children line up with many of the slave owners who were also attendees or members of this church. And so there seem, and also many of the names of enslaved African American adults baptized at this church. So there seems to be a pretty close correlation between children participating in the education offered by the church, and whole Black families participating in the church as well. Occasionally, a church could provide an even greater benefit than education. In 1765, this church received an enslaved person as an estate bequest. The church received an enslaved person as presumably the person put this in their will, intending that the church could benefit from the labor of an enslaved person, or the church could sell the enslaved person for money. Remarkably, and this is the only example I found of this, the vestry of this church voted, quote, "The church warden to hire a room for Markador, formerly a slave of Nathan K. Esquire, deceased, set him free and pay his rent for 1 year." So again, this is a truly exceptional case, I think. But in this case, an enslaved man given to this church was freed and was provided housing for a year. Other churches provided financial support to free African Americans in northern cities. Both Christ Church and King's Chapel in Boston distributed some of their poor relief funds to free African Americans in the middle decades of the 18th century. Such generosity was certainly uncommon, but free and enslaved Black people across the North knew that church affiliation could bring tangible benefits, such as education, access to white patronage, and the opportunity to socialize with others. So many people affiliated in these churches, I think we really have to take their participation seriously. And in some cases, it's clear that the participation had significant spiritual meaning to the people who participated. We can look again at some of Phyllis Wheatley's writings. In Phyllis Wheatley's private correspondence to Ober Tanner, she indicated some of the spiritual benefits that religion provided for her. When she was sick, Wheatley talked about how she was comforted, quote, "by him who declared from heaven that his strength was made perfect in weakness." In a 1773 letter to Englishman John Thornton, Wheatley commented that God was no respecter of persons, being the maker of all. God, she wrote, quote, "therefore disdains not to be called the father of humble Africans and Indians. Though despised on earth on account of our color, we have this consolation." In Middleborough, Massachusetts, one of the people who joined a predominantly white church was a man named Cuffy, who was enslaved by the minister of the church. Cuffy was baptized and joined the church in March 1773. And remarkably, his statement of faith, his religious experience or relation that he shared with the church members survived in the church records. And in these records as well, we see hints of what church membership might have meant for Cuffy. After he was freed, he took on the name Wright, the last name Wright. So Cuffy Wright said that, quote, "Christ is precious to my soul. When I go about my calling and business, I have found many passages of scripture that comfort my soul." He further wrote, quote, "Sin is grief to me. Christ is precious to my soul." While these types of statements are pretty common in relations of faith across the region, they do suggest ways in which Cuffy Wright found comfort in the spiritual practices of this church. Anna Wright, who marries Cuffy Wright after he's free, joined the church in 1796, and this is her testimony that survived in the church records. Anna expressed her gratitude that, quote, "she was born and brought up in the land of gospel light, and my parents gave me to God in baptism." But she went on to lament how she had kind of neglected to build on this good foundation that she had received. Anna was concerned about her soul and about the spiritual danger she faced. She eventually found relief from her sense of sinfulness and described, quote, "the Lord in mercy has, I hope, appeared for me." And the final point I want to make is in some of the ways in which these churches are not only places where African Americans and Native Americans are participating, their participation also changes the religion of New England, also changes the religious ideas of New England. And the clearest example of this is the anti-slavery Christianity that develops in New England around the time of the Revolution. Many of the enslaved people who are participating in these churches are saying that Christianity is anti-slavery, and they are actively playing a role in trying to convince white church members and white pastors to agree. The first evidence we have of this is that in 1754, an enslaved man named Greenwich, who attended the Canterbury Separate Congregational Church, got up in front of this predominantly white church and gave an anti-slavery sermon, long before white congregational ministers are giving anti-slavery sermons. Greenwich referred to passages from Genesis, Exodus, 1 Kings, Jeremiah, and Proverbs. He quoted Exodus 21:16, which states, he that steals a man and sells him, or if he be found in his hands, he shall surely be put to death. He condemned how white people steal as many Africans and bring them over into your country to make slaves of their soul and body. He used the Christian faith that he shared with white congregants to critique his slave owner and slavery more broadly. Greenwich didn't receive his freedom, but he also wasn't kicked out. He becomes a full church member in 1766, and he gains his freedom finally in 1776. We don't know how many other people there were like Greenwich who, when they opened up the scriptures and when they applied the scriptures like they were told to do as good Congregationalists, that they made this argument for slavery. Certainly, when we get to petitions like this, the petitions that African Americans filed during the Revolution, we see the connection between Christianity and anti-slavery that Black New Englanders are making repeatedly. And so this is one example, one of the petitions that's submitted. Enslaved African Americans and their white and their free African American neighbors petitioned the Massachusetts legislature in 1773 seeking their freedom. And they said in these kind of very famous lines, quote, "We have no property, we have no wives, we have no children, we have no city, no country, but we have a Father in heaven, and we are determined as far as his grace shall enable us, and as far as our degraded, contemptuous life will admit, to keep his commandments." Right? They're arguing for freedom from a position of being, as they describe it, faithful Christians. When enslaved people in Hartford, Connecticut, petitioned Connecticut for an end to slavery in 1780, they quoted no less than 9 biblical passages in their petition arguing for emancipation. And they told the legislatures that they, quote, "pray to God that he would send forth his good spirit into your hearts and remind you of your duty to make you instruments for binding up the brokenhearted and proclaiming liberty to the captives." When many of these churches don't grant equality, when they don't treat Indigenous people and African people with equality, ultimately many decide to leave. Many decide to form their own churches. And so, for example, in the 1750s, the Narragansetts, who had been participating in a predominantly white church, leave and form their own church and ordain one of their own as their pastor. In Boston, the first separate African-American church is formed in 1805. And from these churches, the calls for liberty and equality continue into the 19th century and beyond. The early 19th century wasn't an easy place in the North or in Massachusetts for free African Americans, free Native Americans. Right? The struggles against racism, segregation continued. This is a cartoon from an abolitionist publication noting that a colored school, as they called it, was attacked in the free states. Right? Attacks against African American communities, attacks against Native Americans continued. Meanwhile, the voices of Black and Indigenous Christians continued to use Christianity to critique the experiences that they face in the North. Right? As they have created separate institutions, those churches become places where Black and Indigenous New Englanders continue to argue for their rights and continue to argue against slavery. So my book ends actually with two writers from about the same time period, the 1820s, 1830s. Pequot William Apis, an African-American author, David Walker. And in their publications, they talked about how the New England Christians who supported segregation and who didn't condemn slavery in the South were pretend Christians. And they reverse the logic of colonialism. And they said, the Pequots, the Mashpee Wampanoags, African Americans, they're the true Christians. And if white Americans want to avoid God's wrath, they need to convert to the religion of Jesus. And if they do so, they will treat their African American and Native American Christian brothers with equality and fairness. And so with that, I will gladly take questions. And thank you so much for your attention this morning.
Richard, thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. That was a very compelling, yes, presentation. Dividing the Faith and is available on our site. I do have a question, and I'm sure other people do. But you did mention that some of the congregants or churches in the 1700s participated in the modification of African Americans. What does modification mean? What does that mean?
So I probably misspoke a little bit. Commodification,
Oh, commodification. Okay.
meaning right the
Yeah.
turning people into property.
Okay.
Right. So by churches who have in the 18th century a great deal of moral authority in this society, as those churches recognize human beings as property,
Mm-hmm.
right, they are part of that system of commodification that that maintains slavery, that makes slavery exploitative, but also profitable for those who are doing the enslaving.
Thank you. That's stuck out to me. Do we have any other questions in the chat if you want to? Anybody? We have 3 in the chat.
And I see Roshana has her hand raised.
Mm-hmm.
Roshana, you can go ahead.
Yeah, it's less of a question and more likely of a comment. And more of maybe a question as well. You mentioned a couple of times that, those who were enslaved up north were treated exceptionally well. Can you give me some thoughts as to why you make that statement? And I say that because regardless of them maybe not being in conditions that those in the South were in, and, they were still stolen from their families, they still experienced harm and bondage. And so just wanted to know a little bit more about that statement or those statements that you made.
Now, I only meant that to apply to Phyllis Wheatley. I only meant that to apply to Phyllis Wheatley as kind of an exceptional case. But I followed with her own words saying she's still on for freedom. So I was trying I probably did a poor job. On my apology. I was trying to get away from the idea that slavery in the North was somehow easier or better than slavery everywhere else, right? Slavery is absolutely maintained by violence. There is no slavery without the foundation of brutal violence and the threat of brutal violence. And so even someone who's treated well, and I think Phyllis Wheatley is pointed to in that way frequently, still long for freedom because it's slavery. So I think I probably misspoke and rushed that part a little bit. And so my apologies.
No, I mean, and I've heard it before. And I just want to make sure that, we don't forget about the mental and spiritual impact that slavery had on Black and Brown people, despite their conditions, right? I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any
Thank
other
you.
questions? Okay.
I see Julia has her hand raised, and then I'll move on to the chat. It looks like we have a question there as well.
My question for Dr. Boles, thank you for your presentation, is I'd like you to place your research within the context of other research that's going on. I mean, this was an incredible revelation in many ways, what you presented. Is it a case of this information being hidden in plain sight? And have other historians been tackling it as well?
I think it was hidden in plain sight when I started working on this about 15 years ago. I began this project when I worked for the Park Service, giving tours of the Black Heritage Trail in Boston. And the tours ended at the African Meeting House. And it was such a rich, incredible history of religion and protest and activism in the 19th century. But at the time, actually, this was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I didn't see a whole lot of information about what the religious life for enslaved people in Boston was like. Knew there were enslaved people as early as 1637, but I didn't see a whole lot of history for the religious life of Black Bostonians before 1805. And so this began with that question. And I began first by looking at Boston's church records. And then it kind of grew and grew and grew. So I was beginning this serious research about the same time as Jared Hardesty began work on his first book, and Gloria Whiting began work on her book. And I had the great pleasure over this past weekend of kind of reuniting with them in Chicago at a historian conference where we all presented together some of our new research. But I think as many of you know, and as the great speakers in this series have shown us, there's been an enormous amount of really great research that's been done over the last 15, 20 years. And so I've benefited from learning from people like Jared Hardesty and Gloria Whiting, Linford Fisher, about the enslavement of Native Americans in New England, about slavery and family from Dr. Whiting and others. So I felt like my research is a starting point. I was trying to kind of do a broad survey, right? Kind of looking at the big picture across the whole region. I think there's still a lot of other work that people need to do in diving into their specific communities and their specific churches. And I know in the last 15 years, a lot of churches in New England have been doing the work of trying to uncover the history of slave owners and African Americans and Indigenous people in their own congregations. And that work's kind of been exciting to see from afar.
Thank you.
And we have two more questions that just entered the chat. So I'll read those. Deborah King asks, I understand your research focus is on organized churches and their records, but I'm wondering how race informs the Great Awakening.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there was this notion among past generations of historians that the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening, George Whitefield in particular, but also people like Davenport and many other preachers, that in the moment of the Great Awakening, the late 1730s, but particularly 1740, 1741, 1742, that the religious revivals did include people of African descent, and that some had suggested that these revivals were kind of the beginnings of a new wave of African American Christianity. And I think that's true. I think that plays out in the records. We see some of the revival preachers deliberately reaching out to African Americans and Native Americans. There's kind of a deliberateness there that maybe we don't see in other records. But I think what was, and many of the congregations that hosted George Whitefield did see jumps or spikes in African American baptisms around the same moment. But I think that is an incomplete story because I don't think the revivals appealed to all people. Whether that, they didn't appeal to all people, right? We know that there are white people who are not impressed. There are also black people who that's not clearly not the motivation for why they're joining the church. And I think what we'd missed was that many of the churches that did not participate in the Great Awakening also had sometimes substantial numbers of African Americans participating and affiliating and attending those churches. And the Church of England parishes in particular, were opposed to some of the revival practices, but included sometimes, like the one in Newport or Christ Church in Boston, they sometimes included substantial numbers of African Americans, even at the same time as the revivals are happening in other churches.
Very interesting.
Thank you. And then I just wanted to highlight Linford Fisher's comments. And Linford's actually going to be our March speaker. But he says, just wanted to highlight the Congressional Library's New England's Hidden Histories Project, digitizing New England church records, as well as Laurie Stokes' recent book, Gathering into a Church, in response to the question of other scholarship and resources. And he's linked those in the chat for everyone. And it's 11:27, so I think we have time for these last two questions in the chat. But Brian Jones asks, can you speak to the notion of education of the congregants of color within the churches? And another question from Brian, will you continue the pursuit of this research into the 1800s? For example, when did the AME churches emerge?
Yeah, great questions. So in the 18th century, the opportunities for education are mostly church-based, and so the purpose of them is religious education, right? So these sometimes like Stiles, who's having a catechism class that includes white and black children, or like Trinity Newport and many other Anglican churches, they have a class specifically for black children, and they pay a teacher to teach it. In both those cases, religion is the object, right? They're trying to teach religion. They're trying to teach doctrine. But their way of doing it is usually through literacy. They are teaching people how to read. And unlike 19th century antebellum slavery, there's no laws against enslaved people learning to read in these contexts. And in fact, some ministers are actually saying to white congregants, in a couple cases, you're risking going to hell if you don't teach your enslaved person how to read the Bible so that they have the opportunity to read God's word and to learn about Christianity. So the opportunities of these educational opportunities are both religious but also literacy. The book does have a chapter focused on the development of the earliest independent African American congregations across the North. And so I write about Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, Thomas Paul in Boston, primarily pulling from examples from Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston, and how and why those Black churches developed the AME, AME Bethel, AME Zion, but also independent African American Baptist churches. And up in Portland, Maine, the independent, and then in Connecticut too, independent Black congregational churches also developing in the early 19th century. So that is also a piece of the book and the research I've done. So thank you for highlighting that.
Okay. Richard, thank you very much for a very interesting and compelling presentation. Dividing the Faith. I have a copy of the book right here, and it is very, very interesting. I just wanted to highlight a couple things that you mentioned, certainly churches. One is the Christ Church a couple of weeks ago. We was still active in Christ with Christ Church. Christ Church is still active in keeping alive the legacy and history of enslavement as they had a weekend of Darby Vassal weekend where our grand descendant is buried in the undercroft of the church. And that was a very interesting and informative weekend that Christ Church, did host. And also King's Chapel. King's Chapel has been also another uh, church that has been very engaging. And I did want to highlight, and you'll hear more about this on Thursday, February 12th. King's Chapel will be hosting a Slave Legacy History Coalition engagement session. And these sessions are sessions that the Slave Legacy History Coalition has at various churches around the Boston community. And on February 12th, we'll be hosting one there with a discussion of enslavement. We have a video film that we show on the legacy and history of slavery as it relates to Harvard University. This is not an indictment on Harvard per se, but it's just something that they had a quality film that documented a lot. Um, the evening will be moderated by our own board chairperson, Rashana Moore Evans, and it will be held at King's Chapel parsonage on Beacon and Charles. You'll be receiving some information electronically on the evening. So that's February 12th, Thursday, February 12th. So, if you can, we'd love to see you and to hear this very compelling continuation of this American journey that we are traveling. This is American history. We just focus on slave legacy history, and it is something that we're so glad that all of you participate and listen to. It's been a very engaging, actually our fifth year, as I mentioned. We're very pleased that we can continue this. If you have a chance on our newsletter. At the end of our newsletter, you'll see our progress report over the last few years. Please do click on that, read it. That was in part designed by our own Brian Jones, who is also on the board of the Slave Legacy History Coalition. So click on there. It'll give you an overview of what we've done over the last four, going into our fifth year. And not that I normally mention this, but I will this time. On the back, there is also a QR code where you can click on if you would like to make a donation. We could certainly use it to keep our programming moving forward. So please don't overlook that either. We thank you very much for all of your participation. Richard, thank you very much for a very compelling, presentation, and we certainly will. We do put together and recommend books to read, which you will be receiving a email blast with some recommended readings. And Richard, your book will certainly be there. So thank you all very much. We wish you a happy new year. Thank you for being with us. And again, this is our fifth year, and Richard was our 44th speaker of this of our series. Thank all of you for being a part of this, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future. Have a wonderful day. Take care now.